Welcome back. According to legend, Rome's founding was marked by an act of violence. A bitter dispute broke out between twin brothers, Romulus and Remus, as they led a group to establish a new city along the Tiber River. Both agreed that the city should rise on one of the nearby hills, but they could not agree on exactly where construction should begin. Romulus focused on the city's military security and therefore preferred the Palatine Hill, which was more centrally positioned and easier to defend. Remus, on the other hand, was concerned with trade and commerce and favored the Aventine Hill, which offered better access to the river. This disagreement escalated into a full-blown, no-holds-barred argument. Their followers split evenly between the two brothers, forming a Palatine faction loyal to Romulus and an Aventine faction aligned with Remus. With no chance of compromise, both sides decided to seek divine guidance. Each group went to its chosen hill, performed animal sacrifices, and waited for a sign from the gods. Soon after, Remus and his supporters on the Aventine Hill spotted 6 vultures flying overhead. The brothers claimed descent from Mars, the god of war, and for obvious reasons the vulture was sacred to him, so this omen made perfect sense. It seemed clear that this was the sign they had been waiting for. Remus went to his brother and announced that his hill had received divine approval. Romulus replied that, at that very moment, 12 vultures had appeared on his hill. Remus accused him of lying and demanded to see the birds for himself, but he remained unconvinced. Remus argued that although both brothers had received a sign from the gods, his omen had appeared first, which must mean the gods slightly favored his choice. Romulus rejected this interpretation. He insisted that 12 vultures were clearly superior to 6, and that the fact they had actually landed on his hill proved that this was where the city was meant to be founded. The dispute continued to intensify until both brothers finally gave up and returned to their respective camps. Romulus essentially decided to put an end to the debate and began building on the Palatine Hill. His first task was to dig a trench, which would later form the foundation of the city's walls. When Remus saw this, he and his followers marched straight to the Palatine Hill, possibly armed. In a show of anger and defiance, Remus and his supporters stepped over Romulus's shallow trench, and heated words were exchanged. It wasn't long before violence erupted. When it was over, Remus lay dead. According to tradition, Romulus himself delivered the fatal blow. Romulus then went on to complete the city on the Palatine Hill, naming it Roma, Rome, after himself. How much of this story is historically true is impossible to say. Perhaps some of it happened, or perhaps none of it did. What matters is that later generations of Romans fully embraced this tale as part of their mythology. This mythical trench became one of the most important, yet invisible lines in the ancient world, the Pomerium, and for centuries it would hold the Roman Republic together. The Latin word for city is urbs, or urbis, which itself is derived from orbis, meaning circle. So why was the concept of a city tied to the idea of a circle? In legal terms, everything inside a city's Pomerium was considered the true city, while anything beyond it was something else entirely. Most cities on the Italian peninsula had some version of a Pomerium, but for obvious reasons, Rome's was by far the most significant. Over time, Rome expanded beyond the Palatine Hill, eventually spreading across all 7 hills and even further. Some early rulers attempted to deal with this growth by enlarging the Pomerium, but the city expanded too quickly for these efforts to keep pace. Eventually, people accepted the reality that, legally speaking, Rome's official boundaries lay somewhere within a much larger, unofficial city. As a result, the original walls and markers of the Pomerium lost their practical importance and, over the centuries, gradually disappeared. Over time, the Pomerium came to resemble an open strip of space between buildings, marked only by a few ceremonial stone pillars. For the most part, it was an invisible boundary, well known to locals, yet easy for an untrained observer to overlook. Crossing into the Pomerium was a highly ritualized act, deeply bound up with Roman law and religious belief. The intensely legalistic Romans felt compelled to provide a lawful justification for Remus's death, arguing that any violation of the Pomerium, even something as simple as stepping across the unseen boundary, symbolized a breach in Rome's defenses. For that reason, crossing the Pomerium was technically a capital offense. So how did anyone enter the city at all? In strict legal terms, the Pomerium stopped and then resumed at a series of designated gates. In Roman religious thinking, these gates were critically important because they had been approved by the gods in the time of Romulus himself. This logic became somewhat absurd after the physical walls associated with the Pomerium had long since vanished. Plutarch tells a story of Pompey attempting and failing to lead a group of elephants through one of these official gates, even though the land on either side was completely open. It never even crossed anyone's mind to simply step a few feet to the left and cross the invisible boundary instead. That is how seriously the Romans regarded the Pomerium. In fact, in nearly every meaningful way, the Pomerium shaped Rome's political life. The city's highest elected officials, namely the consuls and praetors, were expected to conduct the daily business of governing Rome from within its bounds, passing laws, administering the state, presiding over courts, and performing religious rituals, along with all the other essential duties of public life. Here, just as you might expect, elected officials were bound by Roman law, just like any other citizen. However, once consuls or praetors stepped outside the Pomerium, they were technically considered to be on military campaign and therefore possessed absolute authority over life and death. In this sense, the Pomerium functioned as an invisible boundary separating the civic world from the military one. This shift in authority was symbolized by the behavior of their lictors, the groups of 6 or 12 attendants who accompanied consuls and praetors throughout their terms. Inside the Pomerium, the lictors carried a ceremonial bundle of rods. Once they crossed beyond it, an axe was added to the bundle, signaling to everyone that the official now exercised expanded powers. There was likely an elaborate religious ritual performed each time an elected official crossed the Pomerium, though the details have been lost to history. You might expect this system to invite rampant abuse of power, but for the most part it did not. The Senate usually met within the Pomerium, as did most government buildings. Wealthy citizens also tended to live and conduct their business there, and any official decisions could be challenged in court once a magistrate's term had ended. In this framework, the sweeping authority granted to consuls and praetors outside the Pomerium was extremely useful in times of crisis, but it played only a limited role in everyday domestic politics. The importance of the Pomerium became even clearer in the case of governors and generals, figures the Romans referred to as proconsuls and propraetors. The moment a proconsul or propraetor crossed the Pomerium, all of their legal command authority vanished, instantly reducing them to the status of private citizens. At times, the Senate found itself needing the presence of an active general at a meeting, which created an obvious dilemma. In such cases, the Senate would sometimes agree to leave the Pomerium and convene an improvised session in a public building outside its boundaries, often in a temple. This became a serious issue in the late 50s BCE, during the build-up to the Roman Civil War between Caesar and Pompey, when Pompey was technically still an active general. The result was a remarkable amount of back and forth between different temples and theaters located outside the Pomerium, an arrangement that must have been deeply irritating to more than a few grumpy senators. A related complication involved elections. To run for office, candidates were required to enter the Pomerium and formally declare their candidacy in person. For anyone who was an active general, or worse, a general stationed on the far side of the Roman world, this meant leaving their command early and crossing the Pomerium, thereby giving up their authority. This tension between running for office and holding on to military command should be familiar to anyone following this story. Returning once again to the Roman Civil War, one of the central questions in the lead-up to the conflict was what would happen to Caesar if he crossed the Pomerium. When it became clear that surrendering his command would most likely result in exile or death, he chose not to do so, and that decision helped trigger a civil war. Of course, civil war was the catastrophic exception. The same rule that stripped generals of their authority upon crossing the Pomerium also applied to ordinary soldiers. In theory, there were not supposed to be soldiers anywhere on the Italian peninsula, but in practice this was sometimes unavoidable. In such cases, it was important for everyone to understand that entering the Pomerium for any reason meant the immediate end of a soldier's military career. Taken together, this body of law made it effectively impossible for any army to enter the Pomerium. Put another way, no individual who crossed that boundary could claim to be acting on behalf of the Roman state. As the Romans understood it, violating the Pomerium amounted to a symbolic attack on the city itself, whether the offender was a foreign enemy or a Roman soldier. In the same vein, it probably won't surprise you to learn that weapons were forbidden within the Pomerium. This rule was enforced most strictly when it came to swords, though it wasn't unheard of for people to turn up with clubs or daggers during riots or periods of unrest, likely because such weapons were easier to conceal. Still, there were notable exceptions to this prohibition. In times of national emergency, the Senate could appoint a dictator for a 6-month term. Unlike all other Roman magistrates, a dictator's decisions could not be vetoed. More importantly for this discussion, a dictator's command authority did not disappear upon crossing the invisible boundary of the Pomerium, which meant they could lawfully order soldiers into the city. As a visible symbol of this power, a dictator's lictors were permitted to carry their axes at all times, behaving as though they were permanently on military campaign. Roman citizens understood exactly what this signified, and the sight was deeply unsettling. The dictatorship was an extremely dangerous instrument, which is why it was used sparingly throughout Roman history. A similar but far more commonly employed mechanism was the senatus consultum ultimum, or final act. Under the final act, the Senate authorized the consuls to defend the republic by any means necessary. Any means included the suspension of normal legal restraints, even those imposed by the Pomerium. This may sound like a subtle distinction, but it was a crucial one within the Roman legal system. Under a dictatorship, Rome placed the law entirely in the hands of a single individual, with no oversight whatsoever. Under the final act, the basic structure of government remained intact, but the consuls were permitted to set aside certain laws when necessary, with the Senate still providing supervision. Although the outcomes could appear similar, the final act was far less disruptive to the Roman legal system. The most famous use of the final act occurred in 63 BCE, when the Senate authorized the consuls to suppress a conspiracy to overthrow the state by any means necessary. The consul Cicero arrested 5 of the conspirators and, without granting them a trial, sentenced them to death and had them executed in the very heart of the Pomerium. While the final act technically allowed Cicero to act outside the law in this way, the episode deeply offended many Romans, and he ultimately paid a heavy political price for it. Finally, it's worth turning to elections. Counterintuitive as it may seem, certain forms of voting were actually prohibited within the Pomerium. This restriction was connected to the Assembly of the Centuries, the body responsible for granting military authority through the election of consuls and praetors. During these elections, citizens were grouped into metaphorical military units, with each unit casting its vote as a single block. By now, it should be clear why this posed a problem. We know that real soldiers became private citizens upon crossing the Pomerium. But what about metaphorical soldiers? The law didn't make that clear. And what about the consuls overseeing the election? Running an election with a bunch of metaphorical military units was a bit like commanding one huge metaphorical army. Was that even allowed inside the Pomerium? Legally, it was one massive gray area. To sidestep these tricky questions, on election days, a large portion of Rome's population would leave the Pomerium and head to the Campus Martius, or Field of Mars, a relatively open space outside the Pomerium specifically reserved for military activities, both real and symbolic. Because the only way to cross the Pomerium was through one of its designated gates, what would normally be a 20-minute walk turned into an all-day journey. Wealthy citizens could skirt the inconvenience by leaving the Pomerium early and staying in a villa near the Campus Martius. But for the majority of Romans, this was a serious deterrent to voting. Broadly speaking, the Pomerium functioned as the legal line separating Rome's military from its government. For centuries, it maintained order and prevented ambitious generals from marching an army into the city. That is, except for one massive, glorious, and calculated exception, the Roman triumph. And that is a story for next time.